Imagine waking up in a dark room with no windows, no clocks, no phone, and no human contact. Not for a few hours, not for a day, but for weeks. You don't know the time, you don't know what day it is, and most terrifying of all, you don't know whether you're actually losing your mind or if the world outside has simply stopped existing. Now, what if I told you this wasn't a sci-fi movie, but a real scientific experiment done by psychologists in the early 1950s at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, who had no idea what kind of psychological damage they were about to unleash. They wanted to understand the human mind, and what they discovered shocked them. The human brain, when left alone, begins to turn against itself. This is the story of the experiment that accidentally broke the human mind and changed psychology forever. Before we dive in, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the mind-bending videos we release every week. Chapter 1. The World of Extreme Human Experiments. To understand why this experiment happened, we need to step back into a time when psychology was still a frontier, when scientists believed that the only way to understand the human mind was to push it to its absolute limits. In the 1950s and 60s, a wave of extreme experiments emerged all around the world. Sensory deprivation tanks, forced isolation studies, stress response tests, and even government-funded mind control research. Scientists believed that by stripping away the world from a person, they could observe the pure, unfiltered workings of the human brain. These experiments were often done on students, soldiers, and volunteers who were promised payment, but almost never warned about the psychological consequences. Researchers genuinely believed they were exploring new science. What they didn't realize was that they were walking directly into territory that could unravel a person's sense of self, their grip on reality, and even their perception of time. And from this environment came one of the most disturbing studies ever conducted. One that was supposed to last 6 weeks, but had to be stopped early because subjects were literally falling apart. Chapter 2. Welcome to the Darkroom. The study began with an unsettlingly simple premise. Lock a volunteer in a room completely alone. Remove all sensory input and observe what happens. Participants were placed in tiny, windowless rooms where the walls were padded, the lighting was constant and dim, the food was tasteless, and sound was reduced as much as possible. They wore goggles, gloves, and sometimes even cardboard sleeves on their arms to distort their sense of touch. The goal was to create an environment where the brain received almost no external stimulation. Researchers believed the mind would simply go into a calm, meditative state. They expected subjects to relax, think deeply, maybe even experience a sense of peace. But reality came crashing down almost immediately. Within hours, volunteers began losing track of time. Some fell asleep repeatedly, others panicked because they could no longer tell whether they were awake or dreaming. The brain, starving for stimulation, began generating its own content. Strange images, hallucinations, nightmares that happened while fully awake. The dark room became less of a lab experiment and more of a psychological trap. Chapter 3. How the mind began to break. By the second day, the experiment had gone far beyond what researchers expected. Participants began reporting flashes of light, geometric shapes, floating faces, and full auditory hallucinations. Without external noise, the brain amplified internal sounds, the heartbeat, the breath, the faint ringing in the ears, until they felt overwhelming. Some volunteers heard voices whispering their names. Others saw shadowy figures standing in corners. A few began talking to themselves, just to remember what their own voice sounded like. Even more disturbing was the collapse of time perception. Hours felt like minutes, and minutes felt like days. Some people believed they had been left in the room for weeks, even though only 48 hours had passed. The brain, desperate for structure, began creating its own patterns. People tapped on the walls, repeated phrases, and invented imaginary routines just to feel in control. Sleep cycles completely broke down. One participant asked researchers if it was still the same year. Another begged to know if the world outside still existed. Within days, the dark room was no longer a test of isolation. It was a mirror showing just how fragile the human sense of reality really is. Chapter 4. The Breaking Points. As the days passed, volunteers entered a phase psychologists called cognitive disintegration. They became disoriented, confused, and emotionally unstable. Some cried inexplicably, others became paranoid and suspicious, convinced the researchers were experimenting on them in ways they couldn't see. A few became angry, pacing in circles, yelling at the walls or accusing the scientists of tricking them. One participant reported seeing a parade of squirrels marching in a line across the room. Another described a choir singing somewhere behind the wall. Yet another said a floating figure spoke to him in full sentences. None of this was real, but to the subjects, the hallucinations were as vivid as waking life. The breaking point came when participants started losing their ability to think logically. Simple mental tasks became impossible. Some couldn't remember basic facts like where they lived. Others forgot the faces of their own family members. A few became convinced the experiment had no end and that they had been abandoned forever. When researchers finally ended their isolation, several participants broke down crying in relief. What started as a scientific study had turned into a psychological emergency. The experiment was immediately halted, not because of ethics boards, which barely existed at the time, but because the researchers were genuinely horrified by what they had seen. Chapter 5: The Aftermath. A mind that doesn't heal quickly. The damage didn't end when the volunteers left the room. Many participants struggled with long-term effects: insomnia, anxiety, confusion, and difficulty adjusting back to normal life. Some continued hallucinating for days. Others couldn't tolerate silence, afraid their minds would slip back into the dark room. One participant said silence felt like it had weight, like it was pressing down on him. Another described feeling detached from reality, as if the world around him wasn't fully real anymore. Researchers realized they had stumbled into something far more complex than they imagined. The human mind wasn't a machine that quietly idled when deprived of stimulation. It was a hyperactive engine that began tearing itself apart when left alone. The findings sent shockwaves through the world of psychology, leading to major changes in how isolation studies were conducted. It also raised questions that scientists still struggle with today. How much of our reality is built from the outside world, and how much comes from within? The experiment remained controversial for decades, and many of the original researchers later expressed regret. They had underestimated the fragility of the human mind, and their volunteers had paid the price. Chapter 6: What this taught us about the brain. Despite the ethical issues, the experiment revealed something extraordinary. The human brain is wired for connection, stimulation, and rhythm. Remove those things, and the mind doesn't slow down. It speeds up into chaos. The study helped scientists understand the effects of solitary confinement, long-term isolation, and sensory deprivation. It even influenced training programs for astronauts, submarine crews, and polar researchers who spend long periods cut off from the world. We learned that hallucinations aren't a sign of madness. They're a natural response of a brain deprived of input. We learned that time is a psychological construct that collapses without external cues. And most importantly, we learned that the mind depends on the body's environment far more than we ever realized. The experiment also contributed to major debates about human rights, especially in prisons where solitary confinement is still used around the world. Many of the symptoms seen in the dark room experiment appear in real-life isolation: paranoia, cognitive decline, memory loss, and hallucinations. It became clear that isolation is not just uncomfortable, it is biologically dangerous. Humans aren't meant to exist alone in a void. We are built for connection. The final lesson: the experiment that accidentally broke the human mind remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of psychology. It was meant to explore the brain, but it ended up exposing its deepest vulnerabilities, and today it stands as a warning about the power of the mind, not a power of strength, but of fragility. If you want more stories like this, stories that reveal the hidden, forgotten, and unbelievable truths about our world, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode.